Hello all, welcome to History Lessons. I am Ushme Majumdar and I am going to show you a slide presentation on Europe on the eve of French Revolution, economy, society and politics. The origins of the French Revolution lie deep in French history. The basic outcome of the revolution hastened the nation's development without altering its historical direction. As a famous French diplomat Chateaubriand remarked, that this revolution was begun by the patricians, and the revolution seemed to be the final episode in the aristocracy's struggle against the Capetian monarchy, and thereby it ended the long history of the kingdom. Completed by the plebeians, it made certain the advent of the bourgeois. However, the structure of France in her pre-revolutionary times was no way unique than her neighboring autocracies. Europe was organized aristocratically. The French Revolution, as Robert Palmer has pointed out, was in reality an aspect of European revolution. To further elucidate the statement of Palmer, the revolution was taking place in the world of thought, political ideas, social organization, and economy, and these developments became ripe in France first. France was the first to feel the impact of the changes. Therefore, it happens to be of utter importance to locate and understand the complexities of the entire pre-French Revolution Europe before delving into the questions of why and how the revolution occurred. Let us begin with the economy of Europe at that time. The European economy developed steadily through the final centuries of the Middle Ages, then gained momentum from the mercantilist policies of the great states and exploitation of new lands overseas. In England, during the 18th century, economic progress gained revolutionary force, brought in the reign of steam engine and of mechanized power, and on the eve of French Revolution gave Britain a superiority which was to play an essential role during the long struggle that followed. Europe's economy in the concluding years of the 18th century seemed, despite its prosperity, to share much in common with the past. Now let us see the traditional economy and its developments. The old methods of production yielded a slow and meager output. Agriculture was governed by climatic caprice, industry was restricted by the scarcity of raw materials and the inadequacy of power resources. The peasant labored for his own consumption and sold none of his produce, or sold only enough to acquire the cash that king, lord, or landholder demanded of him. Difficulties of transportation forced each district to live off its own produce. Every region jealously guarded its grain crop, exported little, and lacked the means to import. Despite these restrictions, agriculture was the mainstay of the economy. Everyone was in one way or another involved with land. The individual, rich or poor, who aspired to become a man of property. Now, if we look into this traditional form of economy, we can see that England purchased no more than 1/10 of its wool. Central and Eastern Europe lived in a virtually closed economy. Spain, Portugal, Norway, and Sweden always bought grain, and Switzerland and Great Britain imported 1/6 of their domestic consumption. There was a regular demand for wood, resin, tars, potash from Poland and Russia, for minerals and metallurgic products from Sweden and Germany. Wine, brandy, and salt came from southern Europe, soda and wool from Spain, alum and sulfur from Italy. The major avenues of inter-European trade were the sea routes, benefiting chiefly the ports of. Now let us see how commerce within the states was practiced and how mercantilism played a crucial role in shaping the commercial policies of Europe. Now, if we see the commercial practices, we can only say that commerce within states was relatively insignificant. Transportation by water, as said in the earlier slide, was the only economical way to ship goods, but in this case, rivers were rarely navigable and canals were few, so land route was generally employed. Highways in England, France, and the Netherlands were being improved, but elsewhere there were only more or less rocky trails which were unusable during the winter months. Even the countries with the best roadways, which includes England and France and Netherlands, had neither main routes nor rural roads which could carry heavy traffic, and pack animals were still commonly used. Now, what can we understand, or rather, what can we deduce from these things? We can say that these conditions indicate that no state could have created a truly national market, even if it had not already been divided by internal customs barriers, except for England and manorial or royal toll houses. The doctrine of mercantilism in this period helped to stimulate the European economy. Lord Acton had remarked that mercantilism was the economic analogue of enlightened despotism. Due to their orthodox thinking, the mercantilists sought to restrict imports of goods so as to stop drain of wealth and tax imported goods to prohibitive level. They focused on boosting their respective export, thus creating hindrances in the growth of international trade. It is during this time that Europe witnessed the regained importance of colonialism. Rather, they realized the regained importance of colonialism, and they also witnessed the rise of capitalism and a certain class called the bourgeoisie. Now, once again, bullion poured into the old world, reaching an unprecedented level after 1780. During the 18th century, 57,000 metric tons of silver and 1,900 metric tons of gold were extracted. Of these total, 17,500 tons, that is 30% of it, and 356 tons, that is 19%, respectively, were mined in the last 2 decades of the century. Now, once again, if I need to repeat the numbers, like during the 18th century, 57,000 metric tons of silver and 1,900 metric tons of gold were extracted. Of these totals, 17,500 tons, that is 30% of silver, and 356 tons, that is 19% of gold, were mined in the last 2 decades of the century. 40% of English and French trade were carried on with the colonies. Both these countries fed many colonial products into their exported goods, and because Spain and Portugal purchased those goods, France and England, to a certain extent, held at their disposal indirectly Spanish and Portuguese possessions. This development led to severe Anglo-French rivalries for colonial market. From 1740 to 1763, the English and French fought hard with one another, in which the English emerged victorious while the French lost most of its colonial empire and trade. Along with the colonial structure, we can see that slave trade too brought profits. In 1780, it was estimated that the slave traders of Liverpool earned 3 lakh pounds per year, per year. In the decade between 1783 and 1793, they outfitted between 110 and 120 vessels and sold 3 lakh slaves for a total of 15 million pounds. The figures are astonishing, but these are figures in real sense. Look at the humongous, colossal slave trade. Huge, perplexing. Now, 15 million pounds is a huge amount of money. And this money concentrated in the hands of relatively few individuals, which led to the growth of capitalism. This particular class, where this wealth was concentrated, invested their wealth in banks and provided debts to the governments against interest. The famous banks like the Baring of London, the Hope of Amsterdam, the Swiss Bank of Paris flourished with capital diverted to them by these wealthy individuals belonging to the trading and industrial community. The growth of capital and expansion of bank and that of the colonial markets led to the growth of industries. Now they soon began to exploit the artisanry and to develop a rural industry which paid low wages and did not have strict regulations. Number of towns and factories began to multiply. With it rose the bourgeois class, who battered against the old feudal order of the society, and they were the messenger of the coming revolution. In any case, Europe was growing increasingly wealthy, especially in the West, as was to be expected. Why it is to be expected? Because when I was talking about the traditional economy, we came across a thing that Eastern Europe virtually was a closed economy. Whatever reform in the economic domain was going on was happening actually in Western Europe, and definitely Western Europe was growing wealthy increasingly. And it is believed that the national income of England and of France had more than doubled during the 18th century. Now, George Lefebvre is producing, or rather is furnishing certain facts here, like while England's national debt rose from 16 million pounds in 1701 to 257 million pounds in 1784, and that of France, which was once reduced to 1700 million livres in 1721, rose to 4.5 billion livres in 1789. Within such a short span, means just even shorter span than a century, how many folds their national debt is increasing? Look at this figure. Now, they are increasingly growing rich. Now, what were these implications? Okay, a country is becoming richer. Now, there are certain implications which actually denote these things. Now, one of such things is ostentation. Ostentation has never been confined to any particular period, but an outstanding trait of the 18th century was the pursuit of well-being and of pleasure, enhanced and moderated by a more refined comprehension. To huge living rooms intended for pomp and display were added comfortably furnished apartments that could be easily heated and were preferred for daily living. Styles of furniture changed accordingly. Comfort and attraction were enhanced by varied lines and delicate ornamentation. Use of exotic materials such as mahogany spread. Now, this new wealth filtered down to the artisans, to shopkeepers, and to well-to-do peasants as well. This was evident in a greater consumption of certain commodities like tea drinking, for instance. Tea drinking was becoming the custom in England. In 1794, 8.5 million pounds, mark the figure, 8.5 million pounds of tea, exclusive of contraband, were imported. And when Pete the Younger, who was the Prime Minister at that time, lowered the customs duty, this figure, this 8.5 million pounds of tea, jumped to 12 million pounds just 2 years later. Huge increase. Coffee enjoyed the same success in France. Sugar became a popular commodity. The English are said to have consumed more than the French chocolate and tobacco, beer, wine, and brandy were articles of popular demand. Along with this, there was a rise in population as well. Now, the rise in population is the most noticeable fact concerning the condition of the wage-earning classes, and the rate of increase continued to rise during the last decades of the century. According to the data provided by Georges Lefebvre in his book The French Revolution, Volume 1, France gained 3 million inhabitants after the 7 Years' War. Britain grew from a nation of 5.5 million to one of 9 million people in the 18th century. Austria increased from 20 to 27 million, and Spain from 5 to 10 million, Italy from 11 to 18 million. Fewer famines, plus the additional resources offered by industrial progress, lowered the mortality rate. Now, these are the general characteristics of Europe's economy. The 18th century witnessed decisive economic events, the development of a banking organization, of new business methods, of machine and mechanized power, was to entail a radical change in production, replacing commercial capitalism with industrial capitalism as the driving force within the economy. It is nonetheless true that Europe's enrichment was the basis of an optimism whose intellectual expression was the idea of progress, and which encouraged the men of that era confidently and boldly to undertake the reforms that concomitant changes in social and intellectual life seemed to demand.